Okay, so let's talk about culture and psychology. Um, and throughout your, if you're, I'm going to encourage you if you have comments or questions, um, because I think it helps. It makes for better discussion and better understanding. So, culture and psychology. Um, why is it important? Hold on. I'm missing. Okay, when we're talking about culture, all right, just a pure, simple definition of culture. It's the characteristics of a particular group of people, defined by everything from language, religion, cuisine, social habits, speech, and beliefs. So, given that we study the culture from the Bible, which that culture is the ancient Semitic culture. Hold on just a second. Okay. Uh, I'm missing a slide here, but that's okay. But we're talking about the ancient Semitic Near Eastern culture. Now, we use the word Semitic, and that we do not mean like we say today anti Semitism. And today, when we talk about Semites, we relate it strictly to the Jewish people. That's today. But what we're talking about for the culture in the Bible is the ancient Near Eastern Semitic people, and Semitic was not just the Israelites; it was the entire Near Eastern area that included uh, Syria. It includes the what we now know as Arabia. So when we say Semitic, don't think just Jewish. All right, now why is it important to study the culture? Forgive me that slide got covered up here. It will be in the slides that I send you. Okay, it's important because when you read any literature, you need to know who it was. What you need to know the setting, and you need to know who it was written to, who it was written for. And in this case, the Bible, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, it was written originally, the stories were told verbally, and then they were written down, but they were told to, for, and about the ancient Semitic Western people. And so what has happened because the study of this culture, the way that we study it, um, and from from the Aramaic language, like we had last week, um, if you don't study that culture, then what happens is we apply, we have that's what we have done. We have applied our culture to things, customs, and traditions that have happened then, and then everything kind of gets out of whack. But we have to remember that this particular culture and this version of the Bible was never really known to scholars un, uh, until well, Dr. Lomson started his translations at like around like 1933, but he never finished the Bible until 1957. And so, uh, and so this wasn't around prior to that. But now that we have this, now we can see what the differences are, and it makes a difference in the understanding of how we see it. And you also see, because people applied our culture and didn't have any understanding of this. Now, I got one example, one main example of how we have applied our Western culture. And when I say Western culture, it means Christianity, Western Christianity versus Eastern Christianity, which Eastern Christianity is actually the original Christianity, and it's from like the the third and fourth centuries, and sort of before that. But then the two we have two versions, Western Christianity, and that's what we're talking about. That's what we understand in our part of the world and our churches. So, but one of the ways that it has made a difference, um, and how you can tell is, you see here the Last Supper. Okay, and this is, I believe this is just a copy of, uh, um, well, the guy that the guy that painted it. But what you notice that he has the people sitting at a table. Okay, and that is not cultural. That is not from the Eastern way back then. And now it's very difficult to find pictures that correctly show what it was. But the Last Supper took place around a round cloth on the floor. And this is similar. This is the closest one I can find in terms of people that have demonstrated. But they sat on the floor around. It was like a round tablecloth. Now, I don't know that they're grouped like this, because this is just a painting. But the point here is, if you're familiar with the scriptures from the Last Supper, and I have the one line here, Matthew 26:23. Okay, and he answered, saying, "He who dips his hand with me in the dish will betray me." Well, now a couple things here. Uh, Number one, okay, if you were sitting at a long table, everyone would not be able to. In other words, the custom was, and as you sit at a round table, um, the manners and whatnot, it was highly likely. I mean, it was, you would reach off of each other's plates, no problem. And when they talked about dipping the sops and whatnot, well, everybody dipped. And so, even though we don't really know how this story went, it's better to understand when you see that they can all, when they're sitting around the table, um, they all share, and you can reach in some and in somebody else's. So really, this verse, um, it wouldn't have been just one person dipping his hand and whatnot. And of course, the versions of this you don't know, but the idea is just that we took the uh, what we thought would be the Last Supper and painted it, and that's okay. We're not condemning anything, but that's just one way of how we've applied our culture. And you're going to see too that by not understanding the culture and taking things literally, I mean, we have complete theologies based on, and uh, church uh, uh, denominations based on some of these cultural things that really were not had nothing to do with the religion of the time. It was just culture. Okay, So the first thing we're going to look at has to do with bread. Now, uh, when Jesus when Jesus taught, okay, he spoke about things and expressions that were familiar to the people at that time, and things like, all right, when you read the Gospels, you'll see he talks about vineyards, he talks about sheep, he talks about wine and things like that, and expressions, and we'll be studying idioms and whatnot. Well, these were all familiar to the people. So when he told stories, those people would understand what he was saying. But many times, as we'll see, we wouldn't quite understand it. Okay, but when it comes to bread, all right, bread was the basic food staple. Bread was baked every day, all right, and it was sacred, as was uh, everything. The 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 ancient people, they revered God, and every part of their life revolved around God. So bread, being that it was the main staple, was very, very sacred. And when they were baking the bread, every step in the process, whether it was putting the yeast through the flour or however, every step in the process was blessed as they went along. And they blessed and thanked God also, who was the provider of all. Now let's got some pictures here, so this won't be real. All right. Now, yes, it was sacred. Now, the first kind of bread that we're going to talk about is is called the shoe bread. Okay, and in the well, and you see here the quote from Exodus, and you shall set shewbread on the table before me always. That's how sacred it was. The 12 loaves of the bread that you see there, it's called the bread of the presence, went into the Holy of Holies part of the temple. Every day it was baked fresh. And it was not to be touched. It was not ever touched by anybody um, at all once it was placed in there, and it was removed every day, a new put in there. And so that was called the, if you see this picture that I have right here is a picture of Dr. George Lomsa. And he is the guy that translated the Bible directly from Aramaic, Peshitta scrolls, into English. And so you have him, see him here. The shoe bread is called kade, and he's holding it up. And the holy bread, the shoe bread, was a little different made in size. What he's holding is the actual size, and it wasn't real big, okay, and it was a little thicker than the bread you're going to see next. So that is how sacred it was. All right, and so now we go to, all right, so now we go to the bread, um, everyday bread, okay. Um, and you see what you see here in these pictures. Hold on just a minute. I'm trying to enlarge this so that you can see it better, but I'm afraid I'm going to miss something up. Okay, on the left, on the very left, is you see a gentleman holding a loaf of bread. Now, that loaf of bread, that is what they made daily. Okay, it's very thin, and very big around, probably bigger, a good bit bigger than our probably our large size pizzas. And and now what happened? Now what they would do with it? Now you see in the middle picture. The middle picture is actually Dr. Errico when he was very, very young. Okay, and he was in uh, Holy Land, and they had this bread. So what happened with the bread is they would fold the bread up because if they had to travel, now remember they had to walk wherever they were walking, and if they had to travel anywhere, they'd have to pack up their bread. And so they folded the bread like you see in the middle there, and then the very far right picture, you see that it actually can be folded up, and he has it in his pocket. Uh, what they did is, remember, they wore several layers of clothing, and they would keep that bread with them in their pockets. And on this particular trip that he did, seemingly Dr. Errico says that he actually fed 40 people with that bread by, breaking it off and whatnot. And so what this comes down to, okay, culture, all right? Um, can't hardly see this. Does any one of you want to read, if you can see it, read these scriptures instead of having me reread it? Anybody would like to do that? Oh, hold on. You got to unmute you, Sue. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's okay.
Wait a minute. I screwed up. Okay, everybody unmute yourself. I don't know what. I'm sorry, I messed it up. Okay. Okay, go ahead, Sue, if you'd like to go ahead.
Sure. And he ordered the people to sit down on the ground, and he took 5 loaves of bread and the 2 fish, and he looked up to heaven and blessed them. And he broke them and gave them to his disciples. And the disciples placed them before the people. So they all ate and were all satisfied. And they took up the fragments which were left over, 12 full baskets.
Okay, now this is one of the miracles of Jesus, and but the miracle here, based on what we just talked about, the bread, and the fact that there was 12 baskets left over. All right. Now, what really occurred here, and scholars have studied this for years, and there's all kinds of renditions about what happened and how did Jesus multiply this bread, and they had the disciples in caves making bread. You'll see it if you look it up on the internet. You'll see all kinds of um, stories about it. But what actually happened is you had all of these people, and they had traveled to hear Jesus. They had these bread, and they would also carry dried fish because it wouldn't spoil. And so what really happened here, culturally speaking, is that people decided that they would share. Now, normally they would not do that because they would have to keep their bread to go back home. And but and I okay, now I say this is me because if you know what Jesus taught, and he taught, love your neighbor, and Lord only knows what he was teaching that day, but the idea is that they all shared, and how that's how that miracle culturally is interpreted. Now, what we have to understand is that yes, it is in Christian theology, it's classified as a miracle, Well, that's okay. Uh, I didn't go through the four C's for this group this week, but we're not here to condemn anybody's beliefs or religions, just with the understanding that when you look at this from the culture point of view, you will hear things that are different. So that's that's the bread. Now let's just go on. And just a couple, and the idea too is he used the bread, the idea of bread, when he to relay many things. And what you see in Matthew 6:11 is, um, give us bread for our needs from day to day. And the bread, and actually the word for bread, can be interpreted as needs. So it's not just, well, give me my loaf of bread for today. It's just give us sustenance. Okay. And that is the way in the Lord's Prayer. Normally it's um, give us this day our daily bread. That's the traditional one. This is the way it's interpreted. So, and remember when Jesus said, "I am the bread of life. I am the sustenance, the essence of life, and he who comes to me shall never hunger." So, and you see bread, the meaning used a lot. Okay. Um, another hold on just a second. Okay, and here's another kind of a metaphoric meaning of it, and this is really a neat story. Does anybody want to read that? I don't see Vin. What happened to Vin? Okay, you want to read it, Sue?
Sure. Excuse me.
You did so well. You read it so well.
Okay. When his disciples came to the crossing place, they had forgotten to take bread with them. He said to them, "Watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees." And they were reasoning among themselves and saying, "It is because we have not brought bread." But Jesus knew it and said to them, what are you thinking among yourselves? Oh, you of little faith, is it because you have not brought bread? Do you not yet understand? Do you not remember the 5 loaves of bread of the 5,000 and how many baskets you took up? Neither the 7 loaves of bread of the 4,000 and how many baskets you took up? How is it that you did not understand that I was not talking to you about the bread, but to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees? Then they understood that he did not say that they should be aware of the leaven of the bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees.
Okay, so leaven, the leaven in the bread is teachings. It can also mean teachings, and in this case, it's kind of a funny story because if you can imagine, it's the disciples and what the dilemma they were going through, and oh man, we didn't bring bread, like what are we going to do? And of course Jesus realized it, and you know and then he kind of made a play on it with them, because they were, the apostles or the disciples hadn't learned to have the faith that was there when he did the loaves. So, but anyway, just leaven, it means the teachings, and so just a quaint little story there. Okay, so now we go to the idea of salt. Salt again was very, it was very sacred. Um, it was used to trade many times, but as a token of loyalty and true friendship. And when when people would make covenants, they would break bread and eat salt together. And when they did that, that was uh, that was as good as any signed contract we have today, and it was honored. Uh, there were no breaking contracts, and when that was, it was very, very sacred. And so we have a couple of scriptures here, okay, from Numbers. All the gift offerings of the holy things which the children of Israel offer to the Lord have I given to you and to your sons and your daughters with you by a statute forever. It is a covenant of salt forever before the Lord, to you and to your descendants with you. Uh, okay, and then we've got one from, well, let me do Leviticus. This is where this was established in the law by Moses. And it said, after every offering of your meal offering, you shall season with salt. Neither shall you let the salt of the covenant of your God be lacking from your meal offering. With all your offerings, you shall offer salt. Now that won't go too good nowadays, I don't think. People, well, you shouldn't eat salt, but culturally, this is the way it was. Um, and of course, in Mark, and it's also in Matthew, you know, Jesus references the idea of salt. Oh, how good is salt? But if the salt should lose its savor, with what could it be salted? Let there be salt in you. Let there be sacredness. Let there be true loyalty and honesty in you, and be at peace with others. Okay. Anybody have any questions or comments at this point in time? Okay. Now let's go. Now, culturally speaking, this also um, it it just makes a difference. And I tell you, no matter how many times you go to the Bible and you read verses, and we have for the last 17 years, um, you just come upon more and more things that um, it's like, oh, wait a minute, well, that makes sense. Anyway, so we're going to talk about the wedding at Cana. And one of the things, and again, I don't know uh, uh, how much any of you know about the Bible or have studied, but one of the things about the scriptures, the wedding at Cana, is from our cultural point of view, it's always said, well, Jesus was disrespectful to his mother. Okay. Um, Anybody else want to read a scripture here? Okay. On the third day, there was a marriage feast in Cana, a city of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. And Jesus and his disciples were also invited to the marriage feast. And when the wine ran low, his mother said to Jesus, "They have no wine." Jesus said to her, "What is it to me and to you, woman? My turn has not yet come." His mother said to the helpers, "Whatever he tells you to do it." Now, if you look at the King James, this is part another reason for the misunderstanding. Okay, it's like, "Woman, what have I to do with thee? Mine hour has not yet come." Now, see, this is another uh, um, the the response that Jesus made would have been just normal. It would have been politely correct in that culture, and no one would have thought anything about it. Okay. Uh, and then we have another in the Aramaic language. Last week we learned that each word in the Aramaic language had many different meanings, and we saw some of the difference uh, in the interpretation translation last time. And here we have another one that that it may not make a big difference, but it kind of does make a difference in that. All right, it's the same word, uh, and but it can mean hour or turn. Well, Dr. Lanza, of course, having spoken the language and lived in this culture, knew that this meant his turn had not yet come. Because at wedding feasts, um, well, women actually sit on one side of the room. They didn't participate, but they were there. And the men, but the key here is that the men would take turns supplying the wine. Now, uh, you also have to understand that weddings back then, and I don't know what heritage some of you come from. The weddings back then were very lively affairs. People would get drunk, and matter of fact, if people if the guys didn't get drunk or anything, it was kind of like an insult. Okay. And and each male guest would take the wine, would take turns supplying the wine. And so it was just something. Um, Mary was being a Jewish mother. That's all. She was trying to. She was, taking care of her son. All right. And so then what happened? Okay. So then we say, all right. Um, did Jesus turn water into Okay. Now let's just do this scripture. All right. And there were 6 stone jars placed there for the purification of the Jews, which could hold several gallons each. Jesus said to them, fill the jars with water, and they filled them up to the brim. Then he said to them, draw out now and bring it to the chief guests of the feast. And they brought it. Now notice, and it says, and when the chief guest tasted the water, that had become wine, all right, he did not know whence it had come, but the helpers knew who had drawn the water. Then the chief guest called the bridegroom and said to him, every man at first brings the best wine, and when they have drunk, then that which is weak, which you have kept the best wine until now. Okay, now that this has been interpreted as Jesus' first miracle. Now remember, this is in the book of John. It's not in the other gospels, in the synoptic gospels, but it's here. And but it does not. Okay, culturally speaking, uh, there there would not have been. Um, I mean, this wouldn't be water changed into wine. But here's the explanation. Um, Jesus was at the kind of like one of the last people, all right, to do wine, and yes, he did water, all right, but probably by that time, okay, if you've ever drank a lot, by the time, okay, you always bring out the best wine first, and then after a while, if you're really drinking heavily, you don't know what it tastes like anyway. But he said it was the best. Okay, he said that it was the best to wine at that point because okay, water was very precious, and people drank wine, not water. okay, because water, and it was limited. That they're in the, they were there in the, uh, uh, well, anyway, the water was scarce, and so it was very precious. And the water actually was better than wine, considered better than wine. So what we say from a cultural viewpoint, we don't want to get in trouble with anybody, but so was this a miracle? The only thing we have in the Bible is the statement that when the water, when they brought the water from, they poured the water from the jars, that uh, and it came from Jesus, and when it got there, that it had turned to wine. So another cultural kind of dilemma, but interesting, no less. And of course, well, that's okay. We don't need to go further. Okay, now this is one of the, we're going to go to Corinthians now, so that you can get an idea um, of how. No, we now, even nowadays, okay, we have many things that we do and have carried over that actually have come from the Bible. Um, One of those, now before we get to Corinthians, but one of those is the idea of the right hand is good, the left hand is evil. And now, how that has carried over, now maybe not so much like within the past few years, but if some of you might remember, um, if you were left-handed when you went to school, they tried to make you write with your right hand, and that happened to many, many people. And basically, it's just a carryover from the Bible that, no, the right hand, you got to do the right hand. And there's a lot of that comes from the Bible you just never realize. Okay, but no, this is really important, having to do with the culture and the way we view things too today. So we got 1 Corinthians 11. Anybody want to read it?
Sure, I will read it.
Okay.
But I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of of the wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, and every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for she is equal to her whose head is shaven. For if a woman does not cover her head, let her also cut off her hair. But if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her cover her head. For a man indeed ought not cover his head, because he is the image of and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of the man. For the man was not created from the woman, but the woman was created from the man. Neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. For this reason, the woman ought to be modest and cover her head as a mark of respect to the angels.
Okay, does that stir up anything in anybody? um, um, okay, now, uh, one difference that we'd like to emphasize the difference that's here in the King James, uh, because sometimes it does make a difference as to how it's understood. Sometimes the wording is not quite good. So in the King James, it says, "For this cause ought the woman to have power on her head because of the angels." And uh, once again, when we read this King James um, things, and we read like a sentence like this, which in my mind makes no sense whatsoever, uh, based on even what they said before. Um, but before we had Dr. Lanza, right? we still have people, and they use the King James and other standard versions, which some are different, but most of them do not pick up on the stuff that we're talking about. But what the problem we have with is that many denominations say the Bible is the ultimate inerrant word of God. Okay, you do not question it, and you do not change it. And so uh, whether somebody read this and it made sense or not doesn't really matter, because that's, you're not supposed to question. So, all right, but let's look at this now, because it's clearly um, well, it's clearly cultural, Jewish, and Paul. Remember, Paul was Jewish. And though he had his road to Damascus experience, and he was out there establishing churches for Jesus and whatnot, he never lost his culture, so to speak. So, all right, with regard to those first, I'm just verses, when it talks about women, all right, I have this picture, and that is basically women were required to be covered. Now, you still see that in some places from the Middle East, and occasionally, I don't know where you're from, but you'll see women like this, and so that's what they. But when they talked about the woman, if the woman uh, uh, wouldn't cover her head, then she'd be convicted. And their heads should be shaven. Well, that was just a play to say, all right, they were just like convicted criminals, because women who had committed crimes or whatnot, their heads were shaved, and that's basically what they were saying about the women and shaving their heads. But yeah, but Paul said all that, okay, about women and the man and da 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 da. Now that's what he said. But when you come down to, all right, when you get to these verses, then we see the picture that Jesus, and this is not the only place, but Jesus was clearly for women's equality. Now, what you need to know about women back then is that women were a commodity. Okay, women, they were sold. There was no uh, the, clearly they had no rights. And what Paul was saying is exactly the way it was. And the other thing you got to remember is that men had many wives, and so you have the um, it, some women, were better off than others, maybe because they were pretty or whatever. But you have to keep that in mind when you're talking about and when you're reading about women in the Bible. They had no rights, and they had no means of support except that they would have to have a man, and they would have to marry a man. The other thing about women was, if they were barren, then they were worth nothing. And that was just the way that it was. That was the culture. However, and people miss this line, and maybe it's because of the way it's written here in the KJV, but people miss this. All right, we just heard Paul, and so now we got, nevertheless, in our Lord, and he's talking about Jesus, there is no preference between man and woman, neither between woman and man. For as the woman is of the man, even so is the man also by the woman, but all things of God. Judge for yourselves, and then I put this in here, just judge for yourselves is it comely for a woman to pray to God with uncovered head? But the key point there is Jesus said there is no preference between man and woman. Right? And I just put in there how the way it's worded in the KJV because it is kind of it's just a little different. But Dr. Lamsa made sure, and he said there is no preference between man and woman. And so then we go back to Genesis 1:27. Okay. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. We are all created, made in the image and likeness of God. So, but uh, people miss that. And of course, the idea of the man being had a household, which we have had problems with that and continue to have problems with that from the Bible because well that's what it says in the Bible and that's what Paul said.
Penny,
So yes,
Penny,
yes,
it also says somewhere, I'm not exactly sure where, that woman was created from Adam's rib.
okay. Well, let me tell you about that.
Okay.
All right. The Adam and Eve story is a parable. It's just a story. And the story is written, okay, it was told and written by the ancient Jewish, and I say man because women didn't do that, as their understanding of how man came about. Okay, Adam and Eve. Okay, now, but it is a parable. It is just a story. Now, if you think about this, and I'm sure you may have heard these, but it 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 doesn't all fall together either. When you hear uh, 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 Adam, okay, Eve was created out of Adam's rib, and then you hear, okay, and they were the first man and woman, right? You hear that, okay? Well, then you say, well, then um, who did Cain marry, and how did that all come about? So that is a story. Now, it's my understanding, and I got from Dr. Erica and whatnot, is though in the Bible, okay, we have the creation story as in the first chapter of Genesis. Uh, and then we have the Adam and Eve story in the second chapter. When actually the um, uh, the Adam and Eve story actually came first, and it's classified as a parable, a story. Dating, we're talking about dating wise, and then the creation story came after that. So, and it was a revelation from God. That's what I know about that. But you're right in bringing up that point, and people try to. Well, I'll tell you another Jewish. This is just some Jewish background on that. If you in Jewish, I don't want to say mythology, but it's similar. Um, in their stories, Adam actually had a different wife before Eve, called Lilith. You might want to. It's kind of an interesting story. You might want to look it up just out of curiosity. But that's what. Yes, that's clearly what that's all about. Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So Jesus clearly was for women's equality. There's other places where he talks about how women were abused concerning the divorce laws and whatnot. So clearly he was. All right, now just another little thing here um, about hair. Okay, now we see, and I know because I looked them up today. Again, we see pictures and pictures and pictures of Jesus, and Jesus always had long hair, and we've always, somehow we've always had uh, that idea that Jesus had long hair, but it doesn't it doesn't fit with his with the true image of what the uh, ancient Near Eastern male would have looked like. Now, I go out and try to find pictures, and many times, but I happen to find this one. Now, this one seemingly they said this was made with artificial intelligence to show what it was, and so the main difference is that long they did not have long hair, okay, but they did have, and then this beard is not as full as I would think that he had a full beard, but all the ancient Near Eastern people had full beards, and you'll see them now, like on if you see like Orthodox Jews and whatnot, they have those long beards. But and so I just put the scripture again. This is Paul. Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it is a disgrace to him? But if a woman have long hair, it is a glory for her, for her hair is given her, pardon me, for a covering. But if any man dispute these things, we have no precedent, neither has the church of God. So again, Paul's saying, well, this is really me and this is my culture. Pardon me.
Penny,
Yes.
again, most of the quote Western pictures of Jesus have depicted him with long hair, and so have the plays of Jesus Christ Superstar and all those,
Oh yeah.
which is contrary to this.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, and the other thing that always intrigued me is Jesus, you see the pictures of Jesus with blue eyes.
Yeah,
I mean, and
they're not blue eyes, no.
yeah. But it's okay. That's our cultural thing. People want to make Jesus however they are. I mean, you've seen black Jesuses and whatnot. So
Yeah.
it's okay, but that's the way that it would have been based on the laws. Um, and the other thing I think that people don't realize, because many people just study the New Testament, okay, and they don't have the understanding that Jesus taught from the Torah, which is the Old Testament. He grew up. He grew up studying the Torah. He was Jewish. He studied the Torah. He knew all of the Torah. And the thing that the problem that Jesus had, he didn't have any problem with the Ten Commandments or whatnot. But there was a whole series of other laws that that the elders had made, and those were the ones that he was challenging, like the idea that he couldn't heal somebody on the Sabbath because it was considered work. And I mean, it was just no compassion in that whatsoever. And so to me, it's real important to know that's where that is where Jesus got his teachings from. But what had happened is he saw all these the original we'll just say the original Ten Commandments and whatnot, and people that had just gotten corrupt, and the greed and whatnot, and you had people who were very pious, like the Pharisees and whatnot, and they stuck to all the rules and everything, but they had no compassion for their fellow man. They didn't take care of the orphans and the widows and whatnot. So it sounds a bit like our country today, really, in many ways. And but it's important to understand that that's where Jesus was coming from. He saw these injustices and he tried to teach a way of living that would take care of these injustices, and then everybody could live a good life in peace and love. All right, now I gotta get going here. Okay, and there's a couple readings in your literature there about polygamy and beards, just interesting stuff. All right, so we're going to just jump here to psychology, and basically psychology has to do with how we think and behave as influenced by our culture. And so it's how they thought and behaved based on their culture. So I have just a few. All right, we'll talk about traveling and hospitality. Okay. Um, and we're just going to go to Genesis 19:2. This is a story of Lot. We can't go into the whole story tonight, but it is a great story. Um, but essentially, it goes like this. And he said, "My lords, turn aside, I pray you, into your servant's house, spend the night and wash your feet, then rise up in the morning and go on your way." And they said, "No, we will spend the night in the street." But Lot urged them greatly, and they turned into him, and they entered into his house, and he made them a feast and baked leavened cakes. Now, the idea was, remember, they didn't have hotels and whatnot. When people were traveling back then, they would come to a town, and there would usually be somebody like Lot was then sitting out and say, okay, uh, they believed it was their responsibility to take people in, and they would do that. But here's a custom in the from the ancient Near East. You see, it says Lot urged them. Okay, urging people in the ancient Near East will not originally, that they will not, if you say, oh listen, come on, let's go have a drink, and typically always they will say no, whether they want something or not, whether they want to go. It's in Dr. Eric used to say 7 times, they beg me 7 times, and then I'll do it. um, but that was one of the customs, urging. And so it's hard to say how many times he would have said that, but they would just say, "Oh no, I can't do that." And there's a story that Dr. Eric tells about Dr. Lamsa, and it just resonates with that culture. Dr. Lamsa was he was in this country, but he had traveled probably on a train somewhere, and he was meeting somebody at their house, and it had been a terrible day. He really was tired and hungry and whatnot. He got to the home where he was going, and the people said, "Oh, you're just in time. Come on, um, dinner's on. Have dinner." And he said, "Oh no, I just couldn't do that." Well, the people, they didn't know anything about these customs, so they said, "Okay, you can go back and sit in the library or whatever." And and Dr. Alonso, of course, I mean, he he was hungry and whatnot, but that was a tradition. That's what they did. Now, and the other thing, all right, and this holds to this very day. All right, if you took somebody in, um, like Lot did, and they were in your house. And this would go for, because they would take in enemies, whatever. That's their rule of hospitality. Uh, but they could stay for 3 nights. And they were obligated by this sacred tradition, they were obligated to protect that person in their house and not allow anybody to touch, not allow anybody to hurt them or whatever, even if it was an enemy. But after the third day, then they had best be on their way, because then it it could be whatever. So it was and still is the tradition. Of course, now there's hotels and whatnot, so that's, you know, that's not as much come into play. But they still, if somebody came into their house, they're still responsible to protect them with their lives. Even if it was an enemy. Now, one of the it does still go today amongst many of the tribes, like over in Afghanistan and places like that. And if you care to watch a violent movie called The Last Survivor, it's a war it's a war movie from Afghanistan. But you will see, and at the end of it, it is the same thing. One of three soldiers somewhat got left and stranded there, and one of the Afghanis or whoever the tribe was uh, found him, even though he was the enemy. Found him, took him in, and defended that man, even though the army came together and whatnot. So if you wanted to really see it in action, that's the name of the movie. Okay. Now, all right. One of the main things to understand is in the ancient Near East, the belief the belief was that God was responsible for everything, good or bad. They didn't have an understanding of God like we have, and so anything that happened, okay, it was God. So if you cut yourself, if you stub your toe, even God was responsible for it. Now, mostly what was behind that, though, is that God would God would punish you. God was a punishing uh, kind of God, as well as good. If they won a war, then God, yes, that was so. If they lost the war, then God did it. But mainly, God did it because they had sinned, or they were being they were being punished for something. Now, one of the things, and again, some of that has carried over nowadays, in spite of Jesus changed the whole concept of God. Okay, but but it still carries over nowadays. All right. See, it says here, if there was a natural disaster, earthquake, storm, God caused it, and and it was punishment for sin. All right. Now, that that attitude, in spite of the fact that we have Christianity and it's supposed to be about Jesus, that attitude is still present. And if you remember, I'm going to take Katrina back in New Orleans. Katrina, one of the uh, TV preachers, came on and said, well, that that happened down there in New Orleans because it was an evil city, and um, and they were being punished. Now, little did he know that the French Quarter wasn't bothered at all, and that's the evil part of the city, if there is an evil part. But but see, it has carried over, and those beliefs are still there with some denominations. Uh, and if you were born with a handicap, or your children, whatever, you were considered evil. You're put aside. And although Martin's not with us tonight, uh, uh, Martin had had that experience a number of years ago. Uh, he has a slight handicap, and he actually had people like with their children, would walk by and say, "Ooh, don't go near them." And it's just that attitude that came, but it's Old Testament, it's not Jesus. So, and you also hear, and this is kind of hard to explain, but when you read the prophets, that's all you hear about God. God's bringing His wrath down upon people, um, and now, but that is the way that it was communicated to the prophets and the way it was written down, because that was the belief system. And in the prophets, you read it's always, Israel's always going away from God, and then and God getting mad at them, and then they're coming back, and God is forgiving them. So anyway, it's important psychology when you're reading that. Okay, and then just very briefly, all right, this is just to show you. All right, so this is just a quote from Chronicles. So all Israel and Judah were considered wicked. Why were they considered wicked? Because they believed they were considered wicked because they were carried captives into Babylon because of their wickedness, because they had sinned. That was their belief. They were carried into Babylon because Babylon conquered Israel and Judah, and they were taken away. But it was the belief system of the time. That's what that's what they believed. Okay, getting there. And all right. um, this is a story of Onan, and it's, again, if we had time to read all of these stories, it would be more interesting. But uh, but this is another example of God. Their belief was that God slayed people if they had sinned. All right. Now let's look at this. This is about. This is the story of Onan, and I hope it doesn't have any offensive stuff in here for you, but um, and Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, and it came to pass when he went in unto his brother's wife that he spilled the semen on the ground, lest that he should raise an offspring to his brother. All right, it was considered a brother's duty if his brother's wife died. Okay, that he must. In these days, we would say marry, but he must see to it that the brother's wife has a child, can raise up an offspring. Okay, and that's where we get this, and we get, oh my God, there's so many different misinterpretations of this whole thing, but we won't go into that part of it. But the idea here was, all right, that was a sin. That was a no-no. He was supposed to do that for his brother's wife. He didn't because he knew his brother's wife would have a child, um, and his children would not inherit. In other words, it's all greed and money, whatever. But so he did not fulfill his duty. So what did they say? Now, Onan didn't die right there on the spot or anything, but it was the belief that because Onan did that, that God slew him. But in all actuality, Onan died. Nobody knows when. There's no timing, but he died. But they believe that that's why he died, because he did that. So another interesting story if you want to read it. It's I guess it's X-rated, but it's a good story. Okay. And just one more thing, and then we're going to talk. We got two things about Jesus psychology because it was totally different. Okay. Now, the idea here is everybody, the Old Testament is always about that wrathful God and that, just that's what it's all about. That's what people say it's all about. However, and you've heard it probably said that David was a murderer. Well, I mean, yes, he did. And then some people, I see remarks on some places on Facebook, and I see these things. Well, I just David, he was a murderer, and trust me, people are very upset and frustrated with different religious beliefs that they just now understand. They don't make sense, and they can't, get it. But here's the thing about David. Yes, David did murder um, uh, the husband of Bathsheba. Okay, this story here is about David and Bathsheba, and so um, and I just put this in here. And he wrote in a letter, set Uriah, which was her husband, in the forefront of the battle, and then retire from him that he may be smitten and die. David did do that, and so you could say he was a murderer. But the idea here is Nathan was a prophet. All the kings had a prophet from God. Nathan was his prophet. And Nathan brought it to his attention. It's a great parable, an Old Testament parable. All right. Brought it to his attention that, David was going on and on about these people that did these things and that. And Nathan brought it to his attention that, you're the one that sinned against the Lord. You're the one I'm telling this story about. And so, but the idea here, and the thing about it is, yeah, David was a murderer, but you will read there that David repented, so to speak. And how did he repent? In 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 um in Aramaic and throughout the Bible, you see the word repent. Okay, from Aramaic, repent just means turn to God. Okay, it doesn't mean you have to do penance and go through all these things. It doesn't mean it's very simple. Turn to God. But David, so when this was brought to his attention, you know, David was brought to his knees, okay, and he turned to God and he was forgiven. But nobody pays any attention to that because it's just more exciting that David was a murderer. And I mean, I never, I sort of knew sometimes. I thought, well, yeah, David was a murderer, and how could they have so much respect? But that's the key. He he knew what he did wrong, and he was forgiven. Um, all right, so Jesus changed. He tried to change all of this. He did come just trying to fulfill the law and trying to make it right and make people understand really what the law was saying. So one of the main Jesus psychology, one of the main things, and it should be one of the main things we do today, is turn the other cheek. And this verse is very, you have heard that it was said, and this comes from the Old Testament, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you that you should not resist evil, but whoever strikes you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also. And that is basically, and when you read the Gospels, you'll see Jesus doing that. And turning the other cheek just means take the wind out of the other person's sails. And by doing that, you avoid any more uh, assaultive or violent behavior. You don't push on to have an argument turn into disaster. And so, very simply, that's Jesus' psychology. If you're, if somebody's picking on you or arguing with you, da 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 da, just say something, walk away, do whatever, but take the wind out of their sails. And that's the way we need to work towards having peace and whatever on earth. Okay. And last but not least, this is psychology. It's just the main part of Jesus' teachings. And before I read this, and we'll get done. All right, remember, Jesus, really and truly, he had two teachings and two commandments. Because those two commandments, you don't have to have anything to do with the other ones. And that is love God and love your neighbor. So here, and he puts it out here, and this is really tough for people, but it is the psychology is what we need. Look, you have heard that it is said, be kind to your friends and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies. Bless anyone who curses you. Do good to anyone who hates you. Pray for those who carry you away by force and persecute you, so that you may become sons of your Father who is in heaven, who causes his sun to shine upon the good and the bad, and who pours down his rain upon the just and the unjust. And so love is where it's at. Love is the psychology. And I just put this in here. The Aramaic word for love is huba, and it means to warm, to kindle, to set on fire. Uh, but his whole teaching, love is the cure for all human ills, mentally, physically, spiritually. And that's just Jesus' psychology. It was his way. He showed us his way, which was the way of love and peace, whatever. So, okay, I'm done. Thank you all for being. Now, anybody have any comments or questions? Um, I didn't disturb anybody with anything I said. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm a licensed Unity teacher, and what we teach in Unity is that instead of saying turn the other cheek, it's really to turn to the other side of our divine nature.
Okay, well that's yeah, that's yeah, that's right. Um, just a different way of putting it,
Yeah,
and I'm glad that we get people from different walks of life here because the meaning in sometimes the meaning can be the same, uh, but just expressed a little differently. And I know like from Unity also. Um, we There's just a little story, okay? We traveled around the country for 4 years, and we visited well, some mostly Unity churches, some others, but the one thing that we found was in these Unity churches was these varying varying concepts on, I wouldn't even say, well, on God, okay? And so what we had to realize, because we do know another gal, Unity minister, really well. And so when you say turn to spirit, it's just saying that we're talking about here, turn to God. Uh, Many times people didn't want to use the word God because of this image of God that's still here. The God, the punishing, revengeful God, and people don't, they just can't identify with that. But what's happened is, see, is most Christianity has skipped over the teachings of Jesus and gone to the teachings of Paul. And Jesus, you have to study the Gospels, and it's pretty clear, no matter what version you have, that Jesus taught that God is a loving Father. God is love. God is spirit. And so, but you see, most people in the Christian faith they don't have that picture because it's still, many of our denominations are still focusing on sin and God knows what you're doing and God's keeping a book and all of that, when that's not what the loving Father God does. So, but yes, that it's interesting to have that kind of viewpoint from each, from the side so that we can understand. Uh, because most, you know, many denominations are, well, look, if you don't think the way I do and you don't believe the way I do, well, then they don't, you don't really know what anybody else thinks or whatever. So, okay, well, thank you for that. Anybody else? Okay, like I say now, with regard to to the assignments, like I said, we put this out here now that if you can take up to a year to complete the assignments for a certificate if you want, or you can complete them as you go along. What whatever. We just think people can just set their own guidelines. Okay, and so what I started to say at first, and I will do it tonight when I'm around. I'm like as I say, we had some video editing problems last week, but we've got that resolved. So when you view, all of the recordings will be in the same place there. Now there's last week there was the Aramaic language, which we will fix that, and then tonight, then the culture psychology will go on there, hopefully tomorrow. And in addition, we did this before and I forgot last week, but I will send each of you the these slides in a PDF file so that you have them. You can look at them for your assignments or whatever, and you'll have them. And right now, Barbara, that's the best I can do for a complete study guide. One day we may have a complete study guide that will be a lot more.
I'm a little confused when you say assignments. What are the assignments for this week? And I missed last week, but I did watch the video.
Okay, now remember the thing that I sent you that has that had the reading assignments on it? There for each one of these, you'll find behind it a set of questions behind well, it's probably the second page or third page. I don't know. I think there's 15 pages in that thing, and the written assignment is after the.
No, I didn't see a second page. I don't know. I'll have to look again, I guess.
Yeah, go ahead and look and let me know if you didn't get it. Did everybody else get the written assignments?
I did.
Okay.
And we need to complete all those to get like a certificate that we've taken.
Right, that you have completed. Yes. Yes. And like I say, I'm not setting any time frames. It's up to it's up to you. But again, if you ever any questions or something really blew your mind, or just I mean, we're here most of the time, so you can call or email, whatever. Okay, well, hey, thanks a lot, guys, and
Thank you.
Thank you, Penny.
We will say
right.
good night. And,
Good night, all.
Thank
What's
you, guys.
next week? What's next week? I'll look it up.
I think, yeah, I want to say
I'll look it up.
mysticism, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, all right. Have a nice week.
Bye.
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 Blessings.
Bye.